using ANOVA. That ANOVA is the analysis of variance, but it can be used for any other relationship between categorical independent variable and an interval dependent variable, meaning that it is not only limited to experiments, but it can also be used in other non-experiment analysis. The simplest form of ANOVA is the t-test, the t-test which you are all conversant with. Somebody is not muting, and this is Diana. Diana, please mute. So the simplest form of ANOVA is a t-test where you are comparing means of two samples or two groups. But it can always be expanded to more than one group, rather more than two groups, in which case we have what we call a one-way ANOVA, which is like the t-test in the simplest form of ANOVA. But this one-way ANOVA compares the means of more than two groups at a time, like we saw in the different types of experiments. We have the single group and the multiple groups. And for factorial experiments, factorial experimental designs, the one-way ANOVA will not work for you, but in that case you need two-way ANOVA, whereby you have more than one categorical independent variable, and therefore you have a number of experimental groups at the same time. Here, for example, if you are looking at the effect of water on yield, and at the same time the effect of fertilizer on yield, those are more than one independent variable, and the one-way ANOVA will not work for you. You need two-way ANOVA because the experimental design becomes factorial. We have different measures of association, looking at how a dependent variable and independent variables are associated, measuring how strongly related they are. That is what we mean by association. And this association measure gives values ranging between negative and positive 1, and a value that is close to 0 indicates a weak relationship, and a value close to either +1 or -1 indicates a strong relationship in whichever direction, where it is strongly and negatively related or strongly and positively related. That is indicated by a value close to either +1 or -1. And in your interpretation, you can just loosely interpret a measure as indicating the degree to which the value of one variable can be predicted if you know the value of the other variables. You need one variable, and because you can measure the degree of association, you can have a loose interpretation that since this variable is at this level, then the other variable should be roughly at this other level because of that clause or that measure of association, implying that that measure of association describes a relationship in your data and can be used to make a conclusion on a larger population. Because this measure of association is applied to the sample, and because you have a fair measure of how related the variables are, you are able to make a conclusion on the relationship within a larger population. There are some common measures of association we use. I've sent you some notes to the emails you gave me. I don't know those in charge of those emails whether you have got those attachments. Yes, the attachments came. Can I hear from you?
Yes, we have received the.
We have received.
Prof.
Okay, you share with your colleagues. I've sent two documents. One is on participatory rural appraisal, which I told you to read about, but don't limit your reading on what I've sent you. Just read more documents. And the other document I have sent you is on data management and analysis. So take time and read through those two documents. And some of these common measures of association are well explained in those notes. The Cramer's V, the lambda, the tau, the gamma, as used in cross tabulations. You'll find them in that document. The Pearson's R, that is the common correlation between the interval of variables, where you test whether two variables are correlated or not. And then the R squared, which we get in ANOVA and also in the regression analysis. The details are in that document. Regression analysis could be for a few variables or even two variables, one of which is a dependent variable, or it can be for many variables. When there are only two variables, dependent variable and independent variable, we call that one a simple regression. But when there are more than one independent variable, we talk of multiple regression. And this regression could be linear, meaning that you are hypothesizing that the changes, the increases or decreases in an independent variable will have a certain effect on dependent variable, and that is a linear relationship. But we also have nonlinear regression, whereby an independent variable may have an effect on the dependent variable as it is increased or as it is decreased, but at a certain level, the trend changes or no effect at all. So that kind of relationship is called nonlinear, and you establish that nonlinear relationship using nonlinear regression analysis. We also have qualitative and limited dependent variable models under regression analysis. We could have heard about logic models, probability models, and models. They also appear in different forms, but largely these models test the likelihood of an event occurring. What is the probability that all the students today will attend? the probability is ranges between 0 and 100, because being a probability, there is a side that somebody will attend, that is a 1, or somebody will not attend, that is a 0. So those are examples of regression models for qualitative and limited dependent variable models that you may use in your analysis. Limited dependent variable means that it is limited within some range. That's why, for example, a probability of you attending or not attending is either 0 if you don't attend, if you are not to attend, or 1 if you are to attend. So the dependent variable has limited values. Here I give an example of a regression analysis. Like we have always said, when you are doing the analysis, you should always refer back to your hypothesis. Because you are doing this analysis to test a hypothesis. So you have to check back what your hypothesis says. And in this case, our hypothesis is that when you apply a fertilizer X, the yield of a given crop increases, because that is what you think, that being a fertilizer, and if it is really a good fertilizer, if a farmer applies it to a certain crop, then the yield of that crop will go up, will increase. So that is how the hypothesis was stated, and you want to test it. You want to test the relationship between the yield and the amount of fertilizer applied. And you are hypothesizing that Y, which is yield, is a function of X. Literally meaning that the levels of Y depend on the amount of X applied. The levels of the yield will depend on the amount of fertilizer applied. That is what you think, but may not necessarily be true. So you go ahead and test this hypothesis by running this simple regression analysis. Here you are controlling for all the other factors that could have an effect on yield. The controlled experiment is such that only the amount of fertilizer used applies or affects the yield levels. So your equation becomes Y equals alpha plus beta X. Y is the yield and the X is the amount of fertilizer. The alpha is one coefficient and the beta is another coefficient. The beta will show you by how much Y will change if a unit of X is changed. If you increase the amount of fertilizer X, the yield will change by the coefficient beta. And if you are to plot a curve, the alpha becomes the intercept and the beta becomes the slope. And this is, beta has a positive sign, so it will be an upward sloping curve. And the alpha, therefore, being the intercept, here we call it a constant, basically it imply that if you never applied the fertilizer X, still you would get some yield which is equal to alpha. So literally in the control where the fertilizer is not applied, then we have alpha as the yield. But when you apply the X, then it becomes an experimental design, and you get by how much X changes Y, and putting what would even be harvested without applying the X, which is the alpha. That is a simple regression model and under controlled conditions. But if there are more than one independent variable, for example, you have use of fertilizer X1, you have irrigation, water application, that is X2. We have pesticide that we apply, that is X3. We have use of hired labor, X4, and so forth and so forth. In that case, the regression becomes multiple because you have more than one independent variable, and still it is specified building on what we have seen in the first equations. And if there are some factors that are uncontrolled for, then you add an error term to take care of those factors that could also have an effect on the yield, but they are not accounted by these other four independent variables we have specified. And in that case, your model becomes Y being a function of X1, X2, X3, and X4. That is your function, and the specified equation becomes yield equals alpha, which is the constant. That is the yield you harvest if you don't apply any of these other variables, X1, X4, still you get that yield alpha. And then these X1, X2, X3, and X4, they have respective coefficients, which is beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, and beta 4, which coefficients are used to see how much each of these X's contributes to the changes in Y. And finally, the error term catering for the uncontrolled factors or variables. If you run your model, these signs, the plus in this equation may remain as positives. For example, X1 has a positive coefficient, which is beta 1, and it implies that if you increase the amount of X1, which is the fertilizer, if you increase the amount of fertilizer, the yield of this crop will increase by that level of the coefficient that the results will give you. Assume the beta 1 was 0.5. Beta 1 equals 0.5 in your results that you have got. It means that if you increase the amount of fertilizer by, say, 1 kilogram per hectare, then the yield increases by 0.5 units per hectare, whichever units, whether kilograms or tons. So what I was saying, like beta 2 could be negative. It doesn't have to remain positive because this is just the specification of the equation. But after analyzing, you might find that beta 2 takes a negative sign, and that beta X2 is irrigation, which could be the amount of water applied. If it is negative, it means that increase in the amount of water applied to the crop reduces the yield of that crop. So they have a relationship that is negative. The relationship could be strong, but in a negative direction. When it is positive, the relationship could be strong and in a positive direction. And these signs you get and the level of significance of the coefficients will tell you whether the relationship is significant or not significant by looking at the p-values or corresponding to those betas or the coefficients. Any question?
Prof, so far so good, thank you.
Okay. You haven't been attending. Where have you been?
Prof, I had lost my aunt. I was in the village for all this time. But last time on Zoom, I was there only that I was disturbed by network. But now I'm around.
Okay. We have other models that we commonly use in the data analysis, including mathematical programming models. These include linear programming, non-linear programming. We have multi-objective programming, and these mathematical programming models are commonly used in the optimization analysis. When you are trying to get an optimal level of an application or an intervention, then you need to use these mathematical programming models. For example, if we are formulating an animal feed, you have to optimize the combinations of different ingredients such that the feed you get or you make is good enough to give the maximum benefits, the maximum attributes you want in an animal, and with minimum amount of the resources or the ingredients you use, such that at the end of it all, the feed you have formulated becomes economical to the farmer. And in that case, to determine how much of each of the ingredients to mix will be determined using mathematical programming models. If you are applying some inputs to a crop or a garden, you want to advise the farmer how much of each of the resources he has to apply for a given amount of yield, such that he maximizes the profits, because he doesn't have to apply all the resources he has, and he doesn't have to have some resources redundantly kept. So you go into a mathematical programming model to advise this farmer how much of each resources to combine in order to maximize the yields or to maximize the profits. These other ANOVAs and regressions may not give you that optimization level in those kinds of examples. Even for irrigation, if you are an agriculture engineer, you want to design an equipment for irrigation that pumps water to the garden at the minimum possible cost, but at the same time giving the adequate amount of water the crop needs, such that you don't flood the garden and you don't supply inadequate amounts. So in your designing, you do a mathematical programming such that the benefits of that irrigation system is maximized with a minimum amount of resources and maximum amount of the output you're interested in. If you are a food scientist formulating a food lotion for some given group of human beings, you also have to think about the ingredients that must be in that food that you are formulating, such that you don't compromise on the quality. You have all the key ingredients in the food without necessarily spending a lot of money on unneeded, unnecessary ingredients. But at the same time, that food you formulate should give the expected maximum nutrition benefits to the human being that consumes it. If you overdose the food you have formulated with some nutrients, you are likely to cause obesity, say, to somebody who eats it. And if you use less ingredients, you are likely to cause some other negative form of malnutrition. So you need some optimization modeling in that case. So those are the few examples I can give. And here the formulation is in the crop yield. You want to maximize the yield of the crop Y, but that maximization is called objective function, and it is subject to the constraints of the resources you have, because you don't have a luxury of abundant resources. They are in limited quantities, and yet you want to maximize the yield. So you have take note of the levels of the inputs you use. I give an example of two inputs, the fertilizer X1 and labor X2. A farmer has these two inputs that he wants to apply, and his fertilizer is limited to 50 kilograms. He can't afford more than 50 kilograms. And his labor, he has only 6 workers. He can't get more than 6. So you maximize this objective function, which is yield, subject to X1 and X2 that are applied in levels that are not more than 50. You can use up to 50, or you can use up to 6, but may not be economical to use all those. But the linear programming model will tell you the levels of fertilizer to use that does not exceed 50, and the amount of labor to use that does not exceed 6 workers. And there is a non-zero condition that X1 and X2 must be greater than 0. So that is a condition such that the model does not tell you to use -4 workers or -20 kilograms of fertilizer, because that does not sense. It is advisable that you mute, otherwise you shall have none students attending our class. The other models that you may come across are simulation models.
Excuse me, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
About the non-zero condition, is it a combination of these two resources, fertilizer and labor, that must be greater than 0?
No, it is separate. The fertilizer X1 greater than 0 and the labor X2 also greater than 0.
Okay.
It's not a combination. So you can write them separately. X1 greater than 0, X2 greater than 0. The model does not will not make sense if the levels of these inputs, if the level of each of these inputs is equal to 0 or less than 0. It should be greater than 0. Any other question?
Hello, bro.
Yes.
Morning. Hello.
You ask.
Okay. I want, what happens in the event I chose to use a linear programming model and I have lack of relationship at a certain point during my experiment? Wouldn't then nonlinear programming be better to cover up for the no relationship?
The nonlinear programming model does not mean that the variables you are comparing have no relationship. Let me make a distinction between linear programming and nonlinear programming. Linear programming is where your hypothesis is that when you increase, for example, X1, the Y will always increase. And when you increase X2, then the Y will also increase or decrease. They have a linear relationship. Increasing on X1 or X2 will result into increasing in Y or decreasing levels of Y. Either way, there is a linear relationship. Okay? But the non-linearity is that if you increase X1, for example, Y will increase a certain level, it will stop increasing, it can even start decreasing. So if we are plotting that curve, it is not continuously. Diana, please, can you mute? So if you increase fertilizers, you get an increase in yield, but it doesn't mean that if you continue increasing, the yield will continue increasing. It might reach a point where you overdose the soil such that it even affects, it negatively affects the performance of the crop to an extent that yield starts decreasing. So the relationship is no longer linear, it is non-linear. So if that relationship exists, then you won't be correct to use linear programming, but you use non-linear programming. That's right. Is that correct?
Yes, because I
Okay.
personally think nonlinear will cover up for all those events better than a linear programming model.
I beg your
Because
pardon?
I personally think nonlinear programming model would cover up for all those unexpected relationships, much as I hypothesize that the relationship will be linear.
No, not at all. Not at all. You need to have known that the relationship is non-linear. Okay? So it's not just guess and say if I use non-linear programming, then I have even covered a situation where it is linear. No. Okay. And then simulation models. These are models in motion whereby you carry out what we call dry runs. Dry runs, you have established a situation like using a linear programming model, and you have got the optimum levels at which these inputs should be applied. Now, for a simulation model, you change the coefficients of these values of the dependent variable or of the resources, and you see what happens. If, for example, you have run an equation and it says that to increase the yield of a crop, you need to have applied 20 kilograms of fertilizer. Now, the simulation model, you say now, let me assume the fertilizer amount is increased by 5%. What happens to the yield? Or if I decrease the fertilizer by, say, 15%, what happens to the yield? So it is the model in motion, which is basically the dry runs, and these dry runs will help you avoid costly mistakes in the real operation. You do that test, you see what is likely to happen if those conditions are modified before you say apply the conditions in the field. You don't try in the field before you do some dry trials, simulated trials. You are simulating a certain situation. What happens if I change this input to this level? What happens if the tax rate on consumer goods is increased? What happens if we tax these petroleum products much higher than we are taxing now? How much damage shall we cause to the consumer, and how much damage shall we cause to the government revenue? So simulation models are done before, for example, a tax adjustment is made. Otherwise, just saying, let's tax this commodity, and then you might find that with that kind of tax rate you have introduced, no consumer buys that commodity, and that is very harmful to both the population and the economy at large. So you first do those simulation analysis and you gauge what is likely to happen, and then you decide to implement the policy or not to implement it. You have now a choice on which type of data analysis method to use. You are not confined to one. You have a variety of models, of methods to use. And the choice of the method to use will depend on a number of factors. One, the major one is your research problem. The method you use must be appropriate for the research problem you formulated, and it must be appropriate for the research objectives and the hypothesis test. There you have a choice, but make sure that what you choose is in line with the research problem and it addresses the objectives and tests the hypothesis. 3 is the availability and suitability of data. These data availability and the suitability dictate which method of analysis you have to use, meaning that you first assess the adequacy of the data you have and see whether a given method of analysis will work for you and how suitable the data you have are in line with the method of analysis. The other choice consideration is conformity to theory. Is this method known in theory? Does it conform to the existing theory you are trying to use? If it is not in conformity with the theory, then it is likely to be challenged, or it may not. It may imply that the method is not appropriate because it is contrary to the theory that is well established. The other consideration is the relationships between variables to be investigated. That also dictates the type of analysis method you have to choose. And then the level to which relevant variables are to be summarized. How deep of the analysis you want to go will dictate the type of analysis method you use. If you are just stopping at the descriptive analysis of the variables, then you get some simple descriptive analysis methods. But if you want to go deeper to get a detailed summary of the variables, then you choose some other method of analysis. Then you have the availability of software packages to be used. Of course, you can't think of choosing a method where you don't have a software, unless you want to use your calculator, which may not be appropriate. For example, if you want to do some optimization, you need a software that handles that mathematical programming models. And then finally, you have to consider the media in which results are to be published. The publication of the results, for example, for your master thesis defense, will dictate the choice of the method used. But if it is a simple report, a consultancy report, it also dictates that you choose a relatively simpler method of analysis. So it depends on which media you want to publish your results. Having done the analysis, then you do the interpretation. You have to interpret your results, and in the interpretation of the results, make sure the objectives have been met and the hypotheses have been tested. That is why you actually did the analysis. You do analysis to ensure that the objectives are addressed and to ensure that the hypotheses are tested. Meaning that when you are interpreting your results, you make reference to your objectives and hypotheses. Don't say, after all, this is a different chapter, so I just interpret the results. No, the interpretation must be in reference to the objectives and in reference to the hypothesis. Interpretation of results must make sense. Be logical in interpreting your results. For example, you could have had a regression analysis. You are looking at the effect of gender of a farmer on the yield of a crop, and the dependent variable is yield, and the independent variable is the sex of a farmer, one being a female and two being a male. And you get a positive coefficient for a female. And you want to interpret the results that increasing the sex of a farmer from male to female increases the yield of the crop. That is literally what the results are showing. That's the results of the model. But that interpretation makes sense.
No, Prof.
Yeah.
Prof, like, it does not make sense.
Increasing from a male to a female, it does not make any single sense. It's not logical. So you interpret the results in a logical way that makes sense. Don't just put down an interpretation because of the specification of the model. Make sure that the interpretation of results contributes to the conclusion you have drawn or you are going to draw. It is from the key results which are well interpreted that you always draw conclusions. So the two are highly interlinked. So there are a number of areas that make your interpretation hazy. Hazy doesn't make sense, it is weak, it is too elementary. And we don't want hazy interpretation. We want concrete interpretation of the results. One of the causes could be unclear problem statement or objectives. If the problem statement is not clear, if the objectives are not clear, however smart your interpretation of results is, it will remain hazy because it has no foundation. You are interpreting those results in reference to what? The problem statement is not clear. You are just telling the story, but it has no foundation, it has no basis. The second point is when your data are insufficient. You are trying to gamble, to fill the gaps using your own interpretation. But with insufficient use of data, your interpretation will remain hazy. It won't be firm, it won't be concrete. There is no sufficient evidence. And 3 is inappropriate or incomplete results. The results are incomplete, you did the analysis, but they're incomplete, or they are not appropriate for that kind of interpretation you are giving us. That also makes your interpretation hazy. The other source is when you are concentrating on less important results. There's a tendency of somebody concentrating on results that are less important. You leave out the important results and you concentrate on the less important results. Then you miss out the good points. So ensure that your interpretation focuses on the most or the more important points and less concentration on the less important results. The other haziness comes from exaggerating the importance of the results. You have results, yes, they are good results, yes, but you tend to exaggerate their importance. Now, why are you exaggerating them? Interpret them the way they are without exaggeration. Then we have results whose methods from where or how they were derived are unclear. You have results, but it is not clear how you derived them. It is not clear where you derived them from. So it also gives us doubt that these results are forged. So it should be very clear from where and how those results were derived. The other cause of hazy interpretation is the study design could be faulty. If your design is faulty, if your experiment is faulty, if the design of that experiment is faulty, then it can assure you that the interpretation of your results will be hazy. So make sure that the study design is correct without any flaws in it. Then inadequate link of results to practice. You should always make sure that you establish a link of your results to practice. That's when the interpretation becomes interesting. And then always ensure that there is adequate link of the results to the existing theory. Whatever you do, you are guided by theory. In whichever discipline, there is some underlying theory that keeps guiding you. So make sure that the link of your results theory is always adequate. And then another point is where the interpretation of your results is not tallying with the data. You are creating your interpretation from somewhere, but it is not talking to the data you used. So that also makes the interpretation doubtful and hazy. The other point is incomplete, inaccurate, or outdated review of literature. We talked about how recent or how far back we need to review literature. And remember, when you are interpreting and discussing your results, you need to make reference to the existing literature. Each literature should be complete should be accurate, and should be up to date. Related to that is when your data are outdated. You used outdated data, and the interpretation you are trying to make, there's nothing new you are contributing. So your interpretation will not be interesting. You are talking of history. And finally, your interpretation could be too long and verbose. If it is too long, then the good taste of it disappears. If you are using so many unnecessary words, still one can't make sense out of what you are trying to interpret for us.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes, please.
About outdated data, for example, if I'm to do a time series data on climate data, how outdated is climate data?
Time series data to be outdated.
If for example, I'm to use climate data, how far should I obtain the data? Maybe you would put more emphasis on outdated data.
With time series data, you start from today up to as far back as you can. So it cannot be outdated. It can only be outdated if you started from, say, 2000 backwards. One would want to know where the data between 2001 and 2023. That's what makes a time series outdated, time series data outdated. But when you start from the most current up to the whichever year back you go, then the time series data is not outdated.
Okay.
Starting with the most recent backwards, 40 years, 60 years, 100 years, no problem. But starting from 2000 backwards, the data are outdated. So that is what I'm sharing with you on that. Somebody in the chat is saying, somebody is asking for more time to prepare for the test. I don't know how that one has come in. It is not relevant. So it is a hazy interpretation. Any other question? Write our thesis. Since we have got the proposal, we have collected the data using various methods, we have done the analysis.
Prof, I had typed my question in the chat.
Let me check it. If it is the original data, say for example, defining rigging was defined, what is that? Does it remain outdated? Can you mention it again?
What if the original, like, let me say, for example, the original definitions were made like in the 1990s, like, I get the example of kriging, like the original definition of kriging, and the one that is used up to date was made in 1980. And when I am defining it, I cite the author plus the year they came up with it. That is like 1980. Is that data still outdated?
Anybody to answer Joanne's question?
Prof,
Ah.
Yes,
I remember you had said in class, if it is like original model or a definition, it can be even way back 1940s or even 80s.
yes, I even gave an example of 1768.
Yes, Prof.
Joanna, that is okay. You can, it's not outdated.
Prof.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
Emmanuel.
Yes, I just wanted to add on what the previous discussant has said. You said that there is some literature that we cannot go without, like those books with the principles that we cannot live without. Those ones are okay. We can difference.
That's true.
Prof.
Okay. Yes.
Something more. Yeah, about the definition, it could be possible that maybe they have been revised. So there is maybe a newer data, maybe because of the developments, the definition had been revised. So maybe one would look out for the latest definitions of that topic or subject.
Yes, that is an addition. But even if there has been a revision and for you want to cite the very original one, then nothing will stop you from quoting it, even if it is of 1700. But yes, you are right. You need to, you can't say I'm using a definition, but found so in 1700, when maybe it has been already modified in 2010. So you are right. Take an effort to be sure that that is the original thing and no modifications have been done. But if you just want to go by the original definition, original principle, or original theory, then you go that back, and it doesn't make it outdated because you are just also indicating that it was first defined by digging in 1420. So we write our thesis. You follow a general structure which Makerere University actually gives. I'm sure each of you has guidelines on how to write a thesis to Makerere University. It has a thesis with chapters. There are some modifications that it could be a thesis with the published papers, but let's go by a general monograph. A general monograph will have the chapter for introduction. It will have a chapter for literature review, a chapter for methods and materials or methodology. It will have a chapter for results. It will have a chapter for discussion of the results. And it will have a chapter for conclusions and recommendations. And then finally, the references. And then you can put appendices. Those must stand out. Introduction, literature review, methods and materials or methodology, results, discussion of the results, and the conclusions and recommendations. In some cases, the chapter for results and the chapter for discussion of results are combined, such that you have results and discussion. Depending on what your supervisor wants, you may separate the two, or you may combine them into one chapter. That's up to you also. So the introduction gives a clear background of your study. And it is in that chapter that we have the research problem, what you took to do the research, what motivated you, what needed to be known that is currently unknown, and how it fits into a wider research and the developing strategy. That is what constitutes the problem statement or research problem. We talked at length about that. You even have an assignment for that. Then under that chapter still we have objectives, what you tried to achieve in the research. You state the objectives clearly. You start with the main objective, which is overall. And then from that overall objective, you have specific objectives. We agreed that you can have a minimum of 2 objectives, but you don't have to go beyond 3 objectives, but minimum 2. I don't think you need 4 objectives. Then after the objectives, you have the hypothesis, which spell out the propositions you tested, clearly stated in a statistically testable way. Anything that is not statistically testable will not pass as a hypothesis. Where the study is qualitative or where the objectives are qualitative, then you may replace the hypothesis with research questions. Because if it is qualitative, the hypothesis will be difficult to test statistically, in which case you convert it into hypothesis. But I encourage each of you to have hypothesis. So that is chapter 1, and then chapter 2 is literature review, where you are reviewing the work that had already been done by the previous researchers. And this review of literature must be in reference to the objectives and in reference to the hypothesis. Otherwise, if you don't tally the two, then you will review very good literature, but it will be irrelevant. The examiner will say, yes, he has good literature, but it is irrelevant. Matira, is this your old hand or a new hand?
It's a new hand.
Okay.
On the part of hypothesis, sometimes it's advised that you only use hypothesis if you're doing a quantitative research. Then if you're doing a qualitative research, you use research questions. How are the two different? When to use hypothesis and when to use research questions?
Did you attend the previous lectures?
Yes.
Did you attend when we were discussing the hypothesis?
I attended.
And when we discussed the research question?
Yes.
So what did we say?
From what I understood, you only use hypothesis when you're doing a quantitative research.
Is that true?
To me, it's true.
But I have repeated it here again, that when the objective is qualitative, then it may be difficult to have a hypothesis because you can't test it statistically. But when the objective is quantitative, then you use a hypothesis because you can have a statistical test.
Okay.
I don't think we just made it a qualitative study and quantitative study. Because even what you may call a quantitative study, you may have an objective that is qualitatively stated. And for a qualitative and quantitative objectives, we said instead of having both hypothesis and research questions, you can tactfully embed the research questions in the problem statement and just have a section for hypothesis. That's what we said. Any other question? Yes, Providence.
Yes, Professor, I write my question in the chat.
What appropriate verb to write the hypothesis? Isn't it written in the conditional tense? What do you mean?
I mean that according to the definition of hypothesis, it must be written in conditional tense.
What is that conditional tense?
For example, the hypothesis application of a fertilizer increase the yield of a crop. So when writing, can we write application of a fertilizer will increase the yield of crop, because it's a conditional tense, is a provisional answer in hypothesis.
Basically, to simplify your question, I can say the hypothesis is written in the present tense.
Yes.
Okay.
Question, yeah.
Okay. Any other? We proceed. You have a section of conceptual framework. This is where you are relating relevant theory and its adaptation. You are referring to the theory and you are looking at the concepts and how those concepts relate. And the relationship of the concepts you state with reference theory gives you a conceptual framework. So it's like an adaptation of the existing relevant theory, where the concepts are related to see how one concept links to another and another. Methods and procedures or materials or methodology become the chapter that follows, indicating how you collected the data in detailed way, indicating how you analyzed the data for each of the stated objectives and the matching hypothesis. That analytical techniques must be fully described. Then the other chapter is results and discussion, which we said you can have them as one chapter or you can separate the two. This basically talks about what the results were, what you got after the analysis, what the results mean in terms of your hypothesis and objectives, meaning that you are interpreting and explaining the results, and then you discuss those results in a reference to the existing literature. That is what makes it a discussion. Discussion, you don't discuss alone, but you discuss with other people. Now, in this case, the people you are discussing with are those previous researchers. What did they say? and what are your results saying. So comparing what they said and what your results say gives the discussion. So discussion section, I expect you to cite some relevant literature. You state your results in this chapter, in this order. You have got the results. You present your results first. You give an interpretation of the results second. And 3, you discuss the results in reference to what others got. In that order, please. I repeat. You present a result. For example, application of fertilizer in maize increases its yield 3 times. That is your result, and that's how you have stated it. Now, what does that mean? It means that farmers who use this kind of fertilizer will have increased yields provided the rainfall and the pests are favorable, for example. That is your interpretation. And other studies, for example, Okero also observed that increase in use of fertilizer increases the yield, but the yield is affected by too much rainfall. And that is about that result. In that order, present your result, interpret the result, and discuss your result. Refer to the existing literature. I'm repeating this so many times because there is a tendency of some of you to start by discussing. Okero noted that the application of fertilizer increases yield. In this study, applying NPK increased the maize yield by 2%. And it means that NPK has the needed ingredient for this crop. And you move on. That is wrong. Please start with presenting what you found out from the analysis, give an interpretation of what it means, and then discuss it finally. And of course, after discussion, you derive what your results mean for policy. That is the policy implication. I see a hand here. This is Grace.
Yes, excuse me, Prof. Please pardon your explanation about conceptual framework in relation to what you've been discussing previously about policy implication and then the conceptual framework. I am confusing that too.
Conceptual framework is basically linking the concepts. You have different concepts. You have a concept of a fertilizer and what it does. You have a concept of yield, and you want to bring the two concepts together. That is a conceptual framework. How fertilizer is applied, resulting into no yield change or increase in yield change. For example, if a fertilizer is applied in underdose, then it won't have any effect on the yield. And just applying fertilizer alone is not enough. The fertilizer must be combined by adequate labor to apply it, and also the rainfall must be in adequate amounts. There you are trying to relate the different concepts together, but referring to relevant theory. There is a theory that underlies the use of fertilizer. And you have various concepts that you are trying to put together, how those concepts are linked, how they are related with reference to the existing theory. That is an adaptation of the existing theory, adaptation to fit your study.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay. So having written your chapter of results and your discussion, then you are ready to conclude and recommend. You conclude based on what your key results are saying. Given the results, what is your take? What do you conclude? What do you infer from what the results are saying? Are you saying that indeed NPK increases yield? Yes or no? Are you saying this new fertilizer is useful to the farmer? Yes or no? But this conclusion must be derived from the key findings. Don't just create your conclusion, which is not backed up by the findings. And that conclusion is basically a statement you get after testing the hypothesis. You remember we have a clearly stated hypothesis. This hypothesis, having been tested, the results will tell you whether to reject that hypothesis or fail to reject the hypothesis. Meaning, your conclusion is telling us that you have rejected the hypothesis or you have failed to reject the hypothesis. That is your conclusion. And having got the conclusion, what could be done better or differently for a better situation? And that constitutes the recommendations. Meaning also that the recommendations are derived from the conclusions. Don't derive a recommendation outside the conclusions you have made. The conclusions come from the key findings in reference to the hypothesis and the objectives. And the recommendations are derived from the conclusions you have made. That is how tied the different sections of the thesis are. Any recommendation that is not talking to the conclusions will be a suspicious. It is not a relevant recommendation. It is not backed up by evidence. And any conclusion that is not drawn from the key findings is also baseless. For your thesis, you don't have to have so many recommendations. 2 or 3 recommendations are enough. You don't need so many recommendations. Sometimes I see 10 recommendations, 5 recommendations. Those are so many. Just key, strong, clear recommendations. And these recommendations should be so specific. If you say farmers should be trained on how to use fertilizers, I mean, you need to be specific and indicate who should train the farmers. Don't just leave it to nobody. Don't say adequate doses of fertilizers should be used. Now, by who? The recommendation should be very specific to who implements it. Otherwise, it will be vague. It will be a recommendation like the government should put in place an infrastructure. Which specific government? Is it the local government? Is it the Ministry of Works and Transport? Is it the Ministry of Water and whatever environment? So you need to be very, very specific for each of the recommendations you derive. Eventually, you have an abstract in your thesis. You can't have a thesis without an abstract. Much as the abstract appears much earlier, just before the chapter 1, the introduction, you write it at the end. You don't write it first. An abstract is important because it will be used by other researchers when they are scanning through literature. Like you are looking for literature, you first scan through an abstract. So the other researchers will also scan through your abstract. And you should not use the abstract just as an introduction or the summary of conclusion. This abstract must include the following 6 elements. None of these 6 elements should be left out within the abstract. 1, the research problem. It must be there in the abstract. 2, the objectives. The objectives must be there in the abstract. 3, the analytical method. That one is a must. The data and data sources, you have to indicate that, where it is primary data, where it is secondary data, and the sources, it has to be indicated. And then the main results, the key results, should be in the abstract. And the conclusion must be in the abstract. You may add other stuff, but these 6 are a must be there. Jocelyn, can you mute? So these 6 elements of the abstract of the thesis must be in the abstract. Of course, you start by the general introduction, and then you move on to state the research problem and objectives, and in a summarized way. And the abstract should be maximum 1 page. I don't see why you should go beyond 1 page of the abstract. This is for the thesis. For journal papers, they may limit you to say 250 words or 300 words or whatever the journal specifies. And 250 words is like a quarter a page. But for the thesis, we are saying you don't have to go beyond 1 page, provided these 6 elements are in that abstract. With the body of the thesis, you need to be logical and consistent in your arguments. You need to be rigorous in your approach and avoid unsupported statements. Any statement that is unsupported is like a speculation. So we don't need speculations. Make sure every statement is supported. Be aware of your bias and avoid allowing it to influence your work. Write independently without your bias influencing you. And keep the tone of the writing as impartial as possible. Be very impartial. Avoid personal judgment. For example, avoid words like, these results are good, or the results are bad, or the results are interesting. This finding is surprising. There you are making personal judgments, and we need to avoid those personal judgments. Write it the way it is, without your personal judgment. The results are interesting, and somebody reads the point and he doesn't see anything interesting. The result is good, and one looks at the result one is saying is good, there's nothing good in it. So this personal judgment, please put it aside. Don't use some words that could be avoided. And here I give an example of poverty, the poor people. There are statements that are so strong, but that strength in those words are not necessary. Poverty-stricken people. When you can be more precise and impartial with such a phrase as families with incomes below the poverty line. That sounds diplomatic, but the other one is too harsh, but they mean the same thing. So avoid that kind of partiality and personal judgment. Try to be impartial, try to use soft words, soft phrases. The style must follow the style required by the university. If you are writing for Makerere University, you follow the style given by the university. If you are writing for University of Dar es Salaam, you follow the format given by Dar es Salaam University. And you need to format your chapters correctly from the start. It will save you time rather than drafting anyhow, and then later they say you overhaul the structure of your chapters. Make sure that you are very consistent, in the way you present the headings. These are section and subsection titles, the tables, and other information. Be very consistent. And be consistent in the use of fonts, in the use of bold prints, in the use of spacing, the bullets, and other format issues. Please take care of those inconsistencies. I read in the chat that this online study isn't good because network is not stable. It makes one miss out on discussions. Now, do we go to Kabanyoro for a physical lecture?
It is too late.
I think next
That's
time
what I'm reading here.
Myself in a place with better network.
Sorry?
Next time she should position herself in a place with better network, because it seems she's the only one having the issue.
For us,
okay.
Our network is fine. Probably tomorrow we have another test.
You can't do much, let's proceed. Some tips on writing up your thesis. Writing up your thesis can be the least interesting task. Least interesting in a sense that for you, you already know. You have the results, you got the data, you analyzed, and you have the results. You even wrote the you have the methodology that you followed. You know it off here. Now you are to write it. It can be boring because it is already known to you, and you imagine that it is common knowledge. So you tend to leave out some statements that are, after all, this one is obvious. This is obvious. Please, it is only obvious to you but it is not obvious to other readers. And you're not writing for yourself, you are writing for others. So even what you think is obvious to you, please write it. That's why I'm saying writing up is the least interesting task, because you are writing some obvious things which are already known to you. So you should avoid thinking that this is obvious and you leave it out. It will affect the way you write. Write what you did, what you found out clearly for the others. Don't assume that since you know everybody else knows. Write it out. When you are writing your thesis, you need some quiet time, whereby you don't concentrate on anything else, but you concentrate only on your research. If you can't create that time, you take a lot of time to complete your thesis. So you need to create that sole time where you are only talking to yourself and the literature and no other disturbance. So you can lock yourself in a room for 4 days under fasting and you come out with a thesis. Block time out. Don't mix the time for writing the thesis with the other assignments at your place of work. Just ask for leave and hide somewhere away from your work, away from your family duties, such that you come up with a good piece of the thesis. You can't mix all those things and come up with a thesis within a short time. And as you are writing, you need to give yourself strict deadlines. Come up with a well-formulated deadline and follow that deadline. You say, by this time, I should have chapter 1 written. By this time, chapter 2. By this time, data completely analyzed. And follow those deadlines strictly. You are your own monitor. Nobody will monitor your thesis writing. But if you don't set yourself strict deadlines and respect those deadlines, then it is like an open check, you'll go on forever. And no matter how badly written your first draft is, better have it. It will make your work much easier to rewrite once you have some first zero draft. Some of you want to produce the final draft for the first draft. You are drafting the first draft, but you write it in a way that you want it to be the final draft. That will not work. It will take you a lot of time. So draft whatever raw document you can, and then you improve on it later. Don't write as you edit yourself. You'll waste a lot of time. Just write anything as it comes to you, and then you'll edit later, you'll organize it later, you'll place the paragraph where it fits later. But don't say, this one I can't write it because it appears in another section where I haven't started drafting. Just write it, just draft it. You'll always shift it later. The first draft is zero draft, and it helps you to rewrite a better draft. And no matter how long you work on your research and your thesis, it will not be perfect. Even when you have defended and corrected the thesis and submitted, later after submission of the final draft, you'll find that there are mistakes in your thesis. So remember that taking long on your writing does not necessarily mean that you are coming up with perfect sentences. So don't be so perfect in drafting it. Just be yourself. The perfectionism, put it aside and write normally. Recommending that you should have reviewed the literature in some depth or done your fieldwork and data entry. When you have done that, when you have reviewed the literature in depth, and when you have collected some preliminary data, you start entering the data, and right away you start writing the body of the thesis. Do not wait to have all the literature reviewed and to have all the data analyzed. No, as the data comes in, you start writing already. And then you always improve as more and more data are coming and get analyzed. Don't wait that after all, we are still in the field, we are still collecting data. Keep analyzing what comes. And keep drafting as the data are analyzed. And keep modifying as you get more and more data. Any question? We can have some short break. Over how many minutes?
15.
Okay. 20.
Somebody says 15, another one says 20.
At least 20.
Another one says 10.
10 is sufficient. 10.
10 times 2.
We take 15.
15 times 2. 10 times